Right, everybody. What I want to accomplish with you in this video is a reading of a couple of our stories for this week. Um, and those include Mark Twain's A True Story, repeated word for word as I heard it, and Paul Laurence Dunbar's The Scapegoat. So these are written in close succession, end of the 19th century. And in particular, I want to offer you some different ways of reading fiction that should be useful to you as you pull together your commonplace book and think a little bit more about how we're defining these different movements, in this case, realism, as well as American literature more generally. So what I want to focus on in this reading of Twain, and I'm going to actually add it to the document that I'm sharing, are a few characteristics of fiction that we can read for that may tell us something about the shape of a genre or literary movement or just that author's work. So we have plot, first of all. And within that plot, we can think about the narrative arc, the use of time, the actual action or events of the story, as well as characters and what they're doing. In the Twain story, there are not many characters and very few that have names. So that may make it a little bit easier. Second, we can think about theme or themes. And here we would include among the themes the after effects of chattel slavery on family. That's a big one for sure. Status shows up throughout this piece in various ways. And a little bit of North versus South in the aftermath of abolition, or the first generation after. Finally, if we go down another level, tropes or devices, literary devices that Twain uses in this piece. And military is one of those for sure. It comes up as more than just plot, because actually there's not much that happens with military per se. I mean, they're around, but this isn't about war. And they're used as something other than a theme. They're used to drive the action and the themes forward in a certain way. Similarly, the concept of work or employment, maybe in distinction to chattel slavery, but also in conjunction with it. Now, anytime we're reading short work, every word kind of matters, right? That's not to say that novels have a bunch of filler, but you can have side plots and other things going on, or multiple plots, much more easily than in a short story, where we really need to have a kind of unified overall reading. Now, the first way that reading is conditioned is with the title. In this case, the title is A True Story, as if there was some doubt of that. And then on top of that, repeated word for word. So not only is it true, it is precise and not written by the author per se, but as I heard it. So you have the first person invoked in the title of this piece, meaning the narration is going to have a perspective. It should not be just omniscient. It is going to be somebody reporting what they're hearing. And the idea of word for word, Twain himself did some journalistic writing and anthropological writing. But the idea of a story being word for word as it's heard has a long tradition in fiction and the history of the novel, with this idea of it being reported. So we want to think about how that conditions the reading that we're doing. Twain immediately sets the scene. We have this notable use of quotation marks around Aunt Rachel. And we quickly introduce who she actually is, but it is worth noting the use of familial term like aunt. aunt to whom exactly we don't know, but that is her title. She's 60 years old, and this is being written at a time when, even if it had been told that day, that means that she would have been born into slavery. But assumedly, it's taking place a few years before that. And you want to notice when Twain uses figurative language because there isn't that much of it in here. She's of mighty frame and stature. We get her age, but her eye undimmed. And then we get this sort of metaphorical usage. No more trouble for her to laugh than it is for a bird to sing. So this sort of naturalistic usage, making a comparison to singing birds. So we get all of this characterization of this very jovial woman, and finally the invocation of the I from the title, and who gets to speak first but Mr. C. And as many of you know, Twain's actual given name was Samuel Clemens, so he is a Mr. C. And so there's a sense of maybe some biographism in here as well. I mean, he could have called it Mr. Anything. He didn't say Mr. Clemens, so there's some narrative distance. But it is Mr. C. And he asks Aunt Rachel, how is it you've lived 60 years and never had any trouble? This sounds like a riddle. He knows well that she was born into slavery. He knows well that she is in employ as a servant, but judging by her affect, asks this question. And what any trouble could mean should be something we're focused on here. What kind of trouble is there? How is trouble defined for somebody who is has been treated as property and officially speaking is not any longer? So she is familiar enough with Twain to immediately put him on the back foot. And that's significant as well. And this is part of the realist idea here, that he's writing in a vernacular or a kind of dialect when he has Aunt Rachel speak, and then B, his own kind of stammering and being forced to explain himself. How could you ask this woman? Oh, she'd never had any trouble. And thus begins the story. So he says, I've never heard you sigh. I've never seen your eye when there wasn't a laugh in it. And from there, Aunt Rachel takes over. So we have this heavy use of dialect, and that is notable. It's a choice, right? And there's been plenty of debate about that. When we're talking about African American vernacular of any era or any dialect, by non-native speakers, by people from different parts of the country, to reflect different levels of education, perhaps, all kinds of different things, right? Sex and gender as well. So we do want to consider why he makes that choice and what it does for the story, to choose to try to render this dialect consistently throughout. And as far as trouble is concerned, she leaves it to him, but the first component of this story is, I was born amongst the slaves. I know all about slavery because I was a slave. I was an enslaved person. So, yeah, trouble is what Aunt Rachel was born into. And you notice throughout this piece, there are references to familiarity and similarity of experience. Why does Aunt Rachel need to say just as kind as you as to your own wife? As if, again, you only say that if there's any doubt, any concern, any question of whether her husband would be as kind as Mr. C's own wife would be to him. You can't make children so black that her mother can't love them. But I mean, they're her children and she is black. So this note of kind of human similarity is notable. Why that would be something she'd need to say as part of this story. This last bit, Lord can't make children so black, but what the mother love, and I wouldn't give him up, not for anything in the world. Of course she wouldn't. Why not? The next thing I want you to notice is place here, right? Where there's an attachment to not just being an American, but being a Marylander, being blue hens chickens, and why that would be important. Now, in a slightly more contemporary context, Baltimore, Maryland is the birth of redlining, the practice of heavily segregating cities through urban planning, essentially. So a place that really kind of divides north and south. But there's this strong pride in specific place as a free person. And so we want to think about where that fits into the American experience, the post-abolition experience, and what it means for American literature in this gigantic country we live in, to have this specificity of place. That'll come up throughout these readings. And then, of course, we have the first use of the N-word, the kind of racial slur of racial slurs in an American context that doesn't resonate the same way outside of the type of chattel slavery that this country was founded upon. So we should notice Twain is telling a story from the perspective of a white man. That's relatively clear in the story without needing to be said. About a black woman who is his elder, who is then inserting her own family's voice using this word. So, I mean, clearly not as a slander here, nor even in an ironic way. It is just in a self-referential way within community. Doesn't change the fact that he's a white man writing it. And we don't need to, offer excuses or apologies for it either. As again, as many of you may know, Twain's work being banned has sort of taken on different forms with how Adventures of Huckleberry Finn have, and Tom Sawyer, both of those books, have sort of shifted in why they would be banned. And so this familiarity with black folk and kind of setting her as the narrator of this story is important. But it doesn't change the fact that that word is in there and in some of our other readings as well. The piece is dominated by Aunt Rachel's voice, right? We get a little bit of material between her lengthy soliloquies, right? Again, these notes about her stature are throughout, towered above us. And so this is meant to be figurative language as well as literal. I don't think that she's literally like double Mr. C's size, but she's towering in presence. Talking about having chains put upon them for the auction, and my goodness, it's really, really strong imagery and an immediate reminder of a despicable, vile past, that's barely past at all at this point. So the story itself then follows the plot, follows Aunt Rachel from a little bit of her time as an enslaved subject to the same work, it's worth noting, as cook. And she says, that's what I'm for. So being defined by this labor and what her value is as a free person to white folks upon whom she will still depend for employ. That will not be quite the same in the Dunbar, which is admittedly a story written by an African-American man. So they ask her if she'll do this work. But it's the same work nonetheless. However, immediately she notes the status difference, These aren't small fry officers. They're the biggest ones. The general says it's your kitchen. So she's almost deposed as a military member. The general says it's your kitchen. You don't take any guff. You're among friends now. Now, this could certainly be accused of being a pretty rosy portrayal of how an older black woman would be treated by white military in the North of this time. You know, this is a complaint that is made of lots of the great writers of the Victorian era and through this period, Charles Dickens as well. That maybe this is a slightly rosier picture of how people treat one another. It's not as if prejudice dissolves just because abolition has occurred. So we can make of that what we want to. You can interpret that a number of different ways. Twain is arguably the capital G greatest American writer ever. He may be our Shakespeare or our Dickens or Tolstoy. Again, for better or for worse, make of that what you will. But as far as notoriety being read outside of this context, and so this matters at this early post-abolition moment that he's painting this kind of picture. Now, I mentioned time, and here we see Aunt Rachel's moment of realization that the child that she may be looking for, that she hopes has run off and maybe will come north, was small when they were separated. And only now are they being reunited. We should think about this in terms of the ways families are separated throughout history in moments of prejudicial treatment of groups. Right? So whether it's Asian internment camps during World War II or DHS ICE treatments of families more recently, what is the time of separation? And what does it mean to be separated from somebody, from your family, and then have to think about what they might be like later? This is a theme throughout lots of literature, but it mediates family in a different way because she goes from an enslaved person who's able to be around her son to his aging up into them being separated. And now she's free and without him. So, you have the military throughout, right? You have this note about Henry being done barbering and trying to go find his mother. So that bit of employment. But the way that he's going to need to do it is hiring himself out to a colonel. So moving along with military. Later, we have a ball, and now we have a black regiment on guard at the house. So Twain is writing about some of the complexities of race in Civil War and just after. And the musicians putting on airs. So the status of black musicians at this exact moment in time, and this is before we get into Roaring Twenties, big band, Harlem Renaissance, when there are black and white segregated clubs. We have, through the military, through war in the Reconstruction, this moment where these black musicians with this black regiment have a certain amount of status to trade in. And this continues, these notes on relationship to military status. Aunt Rachel marches on them, trying to chase them out of there, looking like a general. So this bit of status, again, related back to the actual military commander telling her it's her kitchen and she needs to, set the tone as a marker of status. By the time we get into this final paragraph, or I guess kind of penultimate paragraph, I wonder if you all picked up on this because it's a peculiar moment. Let's read a bit, and I'll take it out of the dialect just for clarity's sake. This was about 1 o'clock in the morning. Well, about 7, I was up on hand getting the officer's breakfast. I was stooping down by the stove, just so, same as your foot was the stove. So she's touching him. She's pushing on his foot or nearing his foot as if the stove were that close. I opened the stove with my right hand, so pushing it back just as I push your foot. So they're at a moment in history and a moment of familiarity where she can touch this white man's foot as part of the storytelling now, the familiarity and the closeness. And of course, we know the moment that's coming. It's been heavily foreshadowed. She's either going to find out the son is dead, likely, or she's going to meet him. And so he does. So she does, excuse me. They meet. I got my own again. Which is a heck of a thing to say as somebody who has been owned. To say I have my own back. Weighty stuff. And that would be a fine place to end it. And we want to pay as much attention to the endings of these stories as the beginnings. But it isn't where it ends. It ends with, I ain't had no trouble and no joy. So I don't know if there is a reading available to us other than ironic. She has had enormous trouble. Life has been troubled. We don't see that much of it in the story, of course. Which again is a choice. Talks about being born in slavery. Talks about the separation and the chains. That's bad. But this is not some narration about slavery per se. It's about a reunification. A true story. And now maybe we see why it's called that. Because it's almost unbelievable. I'm sure versions of this occurred. But it couldn't have been that common to be separated like that and reunified. Repeated as he heard it. Again, it takes the weight off of the narration to be truthful or to be interpreting because it's as it was heard. And Aunt Rachel closes with, no trouble, no joy. So this ambivalence in the end. Okay, so we have Mark Twain writing a story as reportage, leaving all the narration up to a formerly enslaved person telling this family story. When we get into the Dunbar then, so that first piece I wanted to read with you in terms of plot, in terms of themes, the uses of employment and military as devices. When we get over to Dunbar, now we have a younger African-American author. He only lived to 33 years old. I think Twain was older than that when he wrote this piece. Who has all of those things. Of course, there's a plot to this story. Of course, there are themes. And of course, there are devices. But I want to focus a little bit more with Dunbar on style. And why don't we let the introduction of this piece show you what that means, and then I will add to it a little bit at the front end of this document. The story is called The Scapegoat, written by a black man, turn of the century. To think about enslaved or formerly enslaved people as scapegoats is almost perverse, right? To be a scapegoat means that you are blamed for some other ills or problems for which you are not responsible or not fully responsible. But, I mean, chattel slavery is about revoking people's humanity, stacking them in boats like property, as property, and selling and trading them and treating them as subhuman. So to say that there's scapegoating there would be odd. And this is meant to take place in the period after. Whereas Twain opened his piece with, it was summertime and twilight, we were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse on the summit of the hill. Place, time of year, time of day. Paul Laurence Dunbar says, the law is usually supposed to be a stern mistress, not to be lightly wooed and yielding only to the most ardent pursuit. This is a lofty, high use of language. So it's conveying an entirely different set of sentiments than did Twain's piece, which is much more, you might say, natural. This is immediately getting into thematics. But even law, like love, sits more easily on some natures than on others. I mean, it sounds like a parable, sounds like a fable. Also, as we talk about style, we want to notice right from the jump. Yes, we have a lofty use of language or tone. It's very commanding and certain. And then we also have a focus within word choice on modifiers, adjectives and adverbs. And look how Dunbar loads them up in this first paragraph. The law is usually supposed to be a stern mistress, not to be lightly wooed, and yielding only to the most ardent pursuit. But even law, like love, which is a modifying phrase, sits more easily on some natures than on others. So, qualification, intensification, words that could carry very different connotations for different people. What does it mean to be lightly wooed or not lightly wooed? What does it mean to personify? So we want to look out for these literary devices. For example, personification. The law as a supposedly stern mistress, not to be lightly wooed and sitting more easily on some natures than others. A lot going on in there right away, none of which sounds anything like scapegoating, and none of which is tied to a specific person. The other thing I want to draw your attention to throughout this piece, and again, we said with short stories this would be the case, is Dunbar's economy of description and offering of context. There is description throughout, but he's very careful with his words and not using too many of them for kind of maximum impact. Furthermore, what we have this time rather than last time is fully omniscient narration. So we're going to go inside of everybody's heads. We're going to know all of their motives. We're going to have some free indirect discourse and why people are saying what they're saying. So things you can't know unless you're in their heads, which is different from the Twain. So continuing on. We get a quick bit of biography. And this is what I mean by economy of description. We describe Mr. Robinson Asbury's upbringing in Cadgers very quickly. Starts as a bootblack, moves to a porter, and then a messenger in a barber shop. He becomes ambitious, learns to use the shears and razor, gets a chair of his own. Then he needs his own shop. That happens within the space of a few sentences. So a very different kind of progression than we got in the Twain story of this freed man who is, or maybe child of freed people, who is quickly finding himself into industry. Yeah. And note the end of this paragraph. He gets his own shop, and he's going to place it where it would do the most good. This is maybe the commanding theme of this piece, is morality and goodness and betterness. What makes it good? Now, the other device I want you to notice that Dunbar uses throughout this piece is embedded, quick socio-political characterization. He's going to use the word Negro here as a more accepted and elevated reference to his people. Obviously, today that would less so be the case, but language changes. So, and then the socio-political note I'm suggesting, their usual tendency to colonize, a tendency encouraged and in fact compelled by circumstances. So the idea of African-American folk a generation after chattel slavery is colonizing is comical. Colonialism in the natural sense is having enough power to drive others out of your space and to make your colonies. That would not be the case with free black folk of the day, of course. But the idea being circumstances is forcing them into colonies. And Asbury, kind of understanding this, unnecessarily calls his shop the Equal Rights Barber Shop. It's unnecessarily because there's only one race about. So again, little bits of political commentary throughout. This guy is not necessarily a charlatan, but he knows what he's doing and he's taking advantage of his position within this area. And they make these notes, Dunbar makes these notes throughout. Something is wise, but not necessarily moral. Immediately then we're introduced to party politics in a way that is in some ways familiar to us today, but maybe a little bit different at this exact moment, dealing with a relatively new voting population. And we foreshadow it. The critical moment that the managers saw they hadn't reckoned with their host in choosing this barber, the Black District, as leader of his people. So he surprises them. So how much could a free black man surprise political party managers of this era? Notice, and this only happens a few times, but it's important for that reason. We have Dame Law being wooed again. So this is not a literal person. This is Dame as in a grand personage of the law, wooing the law. And how better to woo the law than to become an attorney? And here we have the idea of whiteness as ambition and blackness as being uppity or moving above your station. When we find a black man like you, we send him to the prison. If you're white, you'd go to the Senate. So it's pretty cutting stuff for a black author of Dunbar's age to be writing at this time. Then the question should be, who's the audience? Who is he writing it for? Who's going to have access to it? Who is literate at this moment? Plenty of black folks, certainly. But is that the audience for this piece, per se? Or is he also writing it for posterity? Is he writing it for us in 2026? These are questions. And again, we have the idea of wisdom versus morality. We have the idea of merit or connivance that elevates Asbury into becoming a lawyer. And Dunbar doesn't mean this comically, barber lawyer. It's that this guy has risen through social rank to achieve two respectable professions. Now, as far as style again, Dunbar, in a way quite different from Twain, I think, places himself into a tradition that again is of Charles Dickens, with naming characters in a way that maybe reveal something about their personality or their role in the story. So Bingo has a kind of mixed history, but as a exclamation of good luck, looks to be pretty old. Latchet, however, would have been a more recent term in Dunbar's age for the leather strap of a shoe or a sandal. That's a latchet. So this highly functional piece that holds together footwear, which is pretty crucial. And he even makes a reference back to that with blacking boots. So this stuff should never be taken as accidental. We want to give our authors maximum credit for things they could have known and might have placed intentionally, and do our best to judge those intentions from the evidence that we're given. So we get this sense of community infighting. Dunbar, again, word choice, chooses stolen. Asbury has stolen chances from these two, but of course, who does he think he's stealing anything from? He's just advancing ambitiously, but they see themselves as being stolen. And we soon get into the language again of class, status, morality, values, what is better, what is worse, what is higher, what is low. And in this case, the better class of black folk is those who are envious of Asbury's success. So you have to have some kind of standing to even be envious, to put yourself into somebody's shoes. And when they talk about this better class in the next paragraph, the better class decides that Asbury should be abolished. Again, a term that is not chosen accidentally or lightly. Abolition, at this point, means slavery. If you are an abolitionist, you are somebody who is in favor of the end of slavery in the United States. And if you weren't, you may be in favor of controls that look a lot like it. So it comes down to voting. The power is in the vote, and who can control whom according to their vote. So when Asbury gets his first victory in terms of the parades, again, Emancipation Parade, Asbury makes this very democratic statement. Who are the people, the few or the many? Well, I mean, he prefers the many because he's got the many on his side. And Bingo responds to him that he's appealed to the better class. Or he should appeal to the better class, which Asbury reasonably asks him, what are they better? In what way are they better? And Bingo has no answer. It's not use discussing it. We just want harmony. So there is no way to define it. It is an absurd proposition. Couple more notes on word choice. As it's a classic story, right? We have this ambition that's going to happen before the fall. It's biblical in nature. Asbury is reckless. He does daring things. Again, where the adjectives and modifiers are concentrated are points of emphasis here. And when the election is taken to be fraudulent, you have the jealous, the disgruntled, and the virtuous. Which at first blush is a strange coalition. Yeah, okay, jealous, because you wish that could have been you, disgruntled because you lost, and virtuous. Some kind of inherent virtue to the losers, or at least in their minds, virtue to the losers. So as this continues, again, note the moments of political commentary. Someone remembered how the books had been stolen, money freely used, the black vote juggled with as if that were a new thing. Already, this politics has happened before. It's tired. One of those sudden fevers of reform had taken possession. Again, this is Dunbar mocking slightly this impulse. A sudden fever for reform after we just came out of hundreds of years of chattel slavery. And as we get into the fevers of reform, we know who the scapegoat's going to be. The God from the machine commanded them to slay him. So this, again, lofty language, much like the opening of this story, that we need to slay him, but not lynching, not dragging him through the streets, not shooting him dead, using the law. And the judge, who has ostensibly been an ally throughout, is treated kindly. The judge is sympathetic and grateful to not just get annihilated by Asbury's testimony. And we get back to Dunbar's voice with a very clear proclamation of what this tells us about politics of the day. In politics, party reform usually lies in making a scapegoat of someone who's only as criminal as the rest, but a little weaker. It's a timeless kind of message in there. Bingo is a smaller man. Again, better people, greater people, smaller people, poorer people. He could never enter lists against a martyr, and Robinson, even with this 1-year sentence, is a martyr. So the style is utterly different. I didn't need to tell you that if you read these two pieces. But that also means that the emphases are different. What it is we're reading for and how we can read these pieces are different. So that's a couple of views on how to take especially this older literature. And I said right from the beginning that we'd be doing a little bit more with the further back stuff, because we want to build a strong foundation to judge influences and reactions later. But hopefully you found that useful, give you some hints on ways into these pieces, better ways to read them. And I look forward to seeing how, in fact, you have read these in your own work.